There are 2 minutes left before the verdict, and the most expensive lawyer in Ontario didn't know what to say. I want you to think about that for a second. 2 minutes, a man's entire life hanging in the balance, and the person who was supposed to save him, the one billing $480 an hour, the one with the corner office in a glass tower on Bay Street, was standing at the podium, shuffling papers, sweating through his shirt collar. The man in the defendant's chair wasn't sweating at all. He just sat there, quiet, still, watching. His name was Elliot Chandra, 41 years old. South Asian Canadian, with close-cropped black hair going silver at the temples and the kind of posture that made you think he'd been in difficult rooms before. He was wearing a gray sweater that had a small pull near the left cuff. His shoes were clean but old. He looked, to anyone watching from the gallery, like a man who cleaned office buildings for a living, which, for the past 14 months, was exactly what he had been doing. Nobody in that courtroom knew who Elliot Chandra really was. That was about to change. The case had started 3 weeks earlier, and by the time it landed in Courtroom 7 of the Ontario Superior Court of Justice in Toronto, it had already destroyed 2 families and made headlines across the country. The accused was a 17-year-old boy named Owen Hartwell, skinny kid. Brown eyes that were too large for his face, the kind that made him look permanently startled. He'd been charged with aggravated assault causing bodily harm, a charge that carried serious time even for a minor, and one that, if it followed him into adulthood, would close every door he'd ever try to open. Owen hadn't done it. Elliot Chandra knew that with complete certainty, because Elliot had spent 11 years as a Crown prosecutor in British Columbia before a case dismantled him from the inside out. A wrongful conviction he'd fought for, won, and only realized was wrong when the real perpetrator confessed 6 years later. The man Elliot had prosecuted spent those 6 years in prison. He came out with a lawsuit, a broken family, and a look in his eyes that never fully went away. Elliot had resigned the same week the confession became public. He didn't make a statement. He didn't give interviews. He packed a single cardboard box from his office in Vancouver and drove east, and when he stopped driving, he was in Toronto. And the only job he could find that let him think without anyone asking him questions was the overnight maintenance shift at a building on Richmond Street West. He hadn't practiced law in over a year. He hadn't stopped thinking about it for a single day. Owen Hartwell's mother, Sylvie Hartwell, had hired Fletcher Bouchard through a friend of a friend, who said he was the best criminal defense in the city. Fletcher Bouchard was 53 years old, silver-haired, and had a reputation built on DUI cases and one high-profile fraud acquittal that he still talked about at every networking event in the Greater Toronto area. He wore suits that cost more than some people's rent. He spoke in full, resonant sentences that sounded like they'd been rehearsed in front of a mirror. He was also, Elliot Chandra had understood within the first 90 seconds of watching him in court, profoundly out of his depth. Elliot hadn't meant to come to the trial. He'd been mopping the lobby of the building directly adjacent to Osgood Hall when one of the security guards, a man named Gerald who brought Elliot coffee sometimes on slow nights, mentioned that the Hartwell case was being heard that morning. "Kid's guilty, you ask me," Gerald said without being asked. "He's not," Elliot said, and then realized he'd spoken without intending to. Gerald looked at him. "You know the case?" Elliot had read about it. Of course he had. He read everything. It was the only habit he'd kept from his old life, the compulsive need to absorb every detail of every case that made the news, the way some people couldn't stop picking at a loose thread. The evidence against Owen was circumstantial and forensically thin. A witness who'd identified him from 40 meters away in low light. A text message pulled out of context that Bouchard had apparently failed to address properly in his opening. And a timeline that, if you looked at it carefully, if you really looked, had a gap of 11 minutes that nobody seemed to be talking about. 11 minutes, during which Owen Hartwell, according to 3 different pieces of data that had apparently never been cross-referenced, was somewhere else entirely. Elliot finished his shift. He went home to his apartment on Dufferin Street. He sat at his kitchen table, and he read every public document related to the case that he could find. And by 4 in the morning, he understood exactly what had happened and exactly what Bouchard was going to miss. He didn't sleep. He showed up at the courthouse the next morning in his gray sweater and his old shoes, and he sat in the public gallery and he watched Fletcher Bouchard make exactly the mistakes Elliot had predicted, in exactly the order Elliot had predicted. He came back the next day, and the day after that. On the 4th day, Sylvie Hartwell sat down beside him. Sylvie Hartwell was 44 years old, a woman with red-rimmed eyes and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from too many days of being afraid. She taught elementary school in Scarborough. She'd raised Owen alone since he was 6. She'd saved for 3 years to afford Fletcher Bouchard's retainer. She'd noticed Elliot in the gallery on the 2nd day. You notice things when you're desperate that you might not otherwise. You notice the man who sits in the same seat every day and watches your son's lawyer the way a doctor watches a patient whose symptoms aren't adding up. "You keep coming back," she said to Elliot on the 4th day. He nodded. "Do you know him, Owen?" "No." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're watching Mr. Bouchard, not the prosecutor, not Owen. You're watching Bouchard." Elliot looked at her. She had smart eyes behind all that exhaustion. The kind of eyes that noticed things they weren't supposed to. "He's missing something," Elliot said carefully. "In the timeline, there's an 11-minute gap that hasn't come up." Sylvie stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means Owen's phone pinged a cell tower on Spadina at 9:43 p.m. The assault was reported on Bathurst at 9:44 p.m. That's 1.4 kilometers apart. In 1 minute, he paused. A person can't be in 2 places at once. The color changed in Sylvie Hartwell's face. Something moved behind her eyes that Elliot recognized. He'd seen it before, on the other side of a courtroom, when a piece of evidence landed and everything shifted. "How do you know that?" she whispered. "It's in the carrier data," he said. "It's public record. I don't understand why it hasn't been entered." "Can you?" She stopped. Started again. "Are you?" A pause. A long one. "I used to be," Elliot said. She asked him to speak with Bouchard. She asked him that same afternoon, in the marble-floored corridor outside courtroom 7, with the fluorescent lights humming overhead and the sound of other people's crises echoing around them. Elliot agreed. He didn't particularly want to, but he looked at Sylvie Hartwell's face and thought about the man who'd spent 6 years in prison for something he didn't do, and he agreed. Fletcher Bouchard was standing near the water fountain with his assistant, a young woman who was typing on a tablet and looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. Bouchard had his jacket off, his sleeves rolled, the easy confidence of a man who considered himself the most competent person in any room he entered. Sylvie introduced Elliot. Said he had information about the timeline. Said he thought there was something important that hadn't been raised. Bouchard looked at Elliot the way certain people look at maintenance staff who appear in rooms they're not expected to occupy. A flicker of assessment, a conclusion reached in under 2 seconds, and then a very particular kind of dismissal. "And you are?" Bouchard said, not unkindly, the way you're not unkind to someone you don't consider a peer. "Elliot Chandra. I've been following the case." "Right." Bouchard glanced at Sylvie with an expression that said he was very busy and very patient. "Mr. Chandra, I appreciate the community interest, but I've got this handled. We're in good shape heading into closing." "The cell tower data," Elliot said. "The 9:43 ping on Spadina. It hasn't been entered." A small pause, a slight stiffening around Bouchard's jaw. "We've reviewed all the technical evidence," Bouchard said. "The Crown's version of the carrier data shows the 9:51 ping. They cut the record at 9:50. The 9:43 entry is on the raw file, not the extracted summary. It's a different document." Bouchard blinked. Just once. "Owen can't have been on Bathurst at 9:44 if his phone was pinging Spadina at 9:43, Elliot said. "That's the whole case. That's the entire identification argument collapsed in one data point." Bouchard set his jacket on his arm in the careful way of a man buying himself time to think. I'll look into it, he said. Closing arguments are tomorrow morning, Elliot said. I said I'll look into it. He walked away. His assistant followed. Sylvie Hartwell looked at Elliot with something he couldn't quite name. Not hope exactly, more like the tentative, frightened version of it that hasn't yet allowed itself to become real. Will he use it? She asked. Elliot watched Bouchard's retreating back. I don't know, he said honestly. He didn't sleep that night either. He sat at his kitchen table with the raw carrier data he'd pulled from the public court record, and he cross-referenced it with the extracted summary that the Crown had filed. And the gap was there, sharp and obvious and devastating, exactly where he'd known it would be. He thought about Owen Hartwell's two large eyes, about Sylvie who taught 8-year-olds in Scarborough and had spent 3 years of savings on a lawyer who was going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow and miss the most important minute of data in the entire case. At 2 in the morning, he made a phone call he hadn't made in over a year. She picked up onto the third ring, which meant, or she'd been waiting for exactly this. Elliot. Her voice was careful. Judith Asante Mensah, the only person from his old life he still spoke to sometimes, 62 years old, former Chief Justice of the BC Supreme Court, now retired and living in Oakville and apparently still available at 2 in the morning. I was wondering when you'd call. I need to think through something. I know. Tell me. He told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about Judith Asante Mensah that had always made her extraordinary. When he finished, there was a silence that was not empty but full. You know what you need to do, she said. I'm not licensed in Ontario. No. But you can walk into that courtroom tomorrow as a member of the public. And if the right person asks the right question, Bouchard won't. Elliot was certain of this now. He'd seen it in the man's face. The data point Elliot had raised had frightened Bouchard, and frightened lawyers did one of two things. The good ones ran toward the fear. The others covered it with confidence and hoped for the best. Then talk to the mother again, Judith said. Tonight, if you can. She needs to understand what she's asking Bouchard directly, in writing, before 9 a.m. A pause. You can't walk away from this one, Elliot. He knew that. He'd known it since the 4th day in the gallery. I know, he said. Sylvie Hartwell answered her door at 2:47 a.m. in a housecoat with a coffee mug already in her hand, as if she'd been expecting someone, or maybe just couldn't sleep either. When Elliot showed her the two documents side by side, the raw carrier data, the Crown's extracted summary, she sat down at her kitchen table and looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then she looked up. What do I do? She said. You send Bouchard an email, right now, time-stamped. You ask him, in writing, whether he has reviewed the raw carrier data file submitted under Exhibit 14B as distinct from the Crown's extracted summary. You use those exact words. If he hasn't, if he responds or fails to respond by 8 a.m., you have grounds to raise it yourself in court. I can't raise anything in court. I'm not a lawyer, no. But you're the client's mother. And if you stand up in that gallery and ask to address the court directly, a judge will give you 30 seconds. That's all you need. Sylvie stared at him. They'll throw me out, maybe. But if you say the words raw carrier data, Exhibit 14B, 9:43 p.m. cell tower out loud in that courtroom before closing arguments, the judge will have heard it. And a good judge. He stopped. Justice Fenwick. I watched her for 3 days. She's thorough. She'll pull the document herself. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a streetcar made its 2 in the morning sound on Dufferin Street. Why are you doing this? Sylvie said. Not suspicious. Just honest. You don't know us. Elliot thought about the man with the eyes that never fully went away. Thought about the box he'd packed from his Vancouver office. Thought about 14 months of overnight shifts and empty mornings. I made a mistake once, he said. A serious one. I can't fix it. But I can. He stopped. Sometimes you just can't walk away. Sylvie looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone. Bouchard did not respond to the email by 8 a.m. He did not respond by 8:30 either, which was when Elliot arrived at the courthouse and took his seat in the gallery, in the same chair he'd sat in for 4 days, and watched Fletcher Bouchard arrange his notes with the particular precision of a man about to give a performance he'd been preparing for weeks. Sylva Hartwell sat 3 rows ahead of Elliot. He could see her shoulders. They were rigid. Justice Renata Fenwick entered at 9:02 a.m. A woman in her late 50s with reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead, and the unhurried manner of someone who had presided over thousands of hours of human disaster and had learned to be neither rushed by it nor unmoved by it. She called the court to order. She invited Mr. Bouchard to begin his closing. Bouchard stood. He buttoned his jacket. He began. He was good, technically. Elliot had to admit that. His language was precise, his structure sound, his tone exactly calibrated to convey confidence without arrogance. He addressed the witness identification issue cleanly. He pointed out inconsistencies in the Crown's timeline. He did not mention Exhibit 14B. He did not mention 9:43 p.m. He did not mention the Spadina cell tower. Elliot watched it happen in real time, the shape of an acquittal that wasn't going to arrive, the defense that was almost complete but not quite, the door that was right there, and Bouchard walking past it without even seeing it. The closing took 22 minutes. When Bouchard sat down, Elliot heard the quiet exhale from 3 rows ahead. Sylvie losing air, trying not to make a sound. Justice Fenwick made a note. She looked up. "Before I hear from the Crown, I have a preliminary question for the defense." Her voice was even. Academic, almost. "Mr. Bouchard, the technical evidence in this matter, specifically the telecommunications records. I want to confirm the defense has reviewed the full exhibit package as filed, not the summary document provided by the Crown." A silence. Not a long one, maybe 4 seconds. But Elliot had spent 11 years reading silences in courtrooms, and this one told him everything. "We have reviewed the telecommunications evidence, Your Honor," Bouchard said. "The raw carrier data, Exhibit 14B in its entirety." Another silence, shorter this time. "We." Bouchard stopped, started again. "The defense would request a brief recess to confirm the specific document reference, Your Honor." Justice Fenwick looked at him over her reading glasses for one long, level moment. "I'll grant 15 minutes, she said, "and when we return, I'd like both counsel at the bench." What happened in those 15 minutes, Elliot would only hear about partially, and only later. Bouchard found the raw carrier data, saw the 9:43 entry, understood what it meant in approximately the time it takes a very good lawyer to read 8 lines of technical data. He then did the thing that, whatever Elliot thought of his courtroom performance, indicated that somewhere under the expensive suit and the $480 an hour confidence, there was an actual commitment to the outcome. He walked back into that courtroom and told Justice Fenwick exactly what he'd found. He also told her, Elliot learned later, that a member of the public had flagged the discrepancy 4 days earlier and that he had not adequately followed up. Justice Fenwick did not look pleased, but she looked, unmistakably, like someone who had just found the thing she'd been quietly looking for. The Crown was given time to respond. They could not. The raw data was the raw data. The 9:43 ping was the 9:43 ping. Owen Hartwell's phone had been 1.4 kilometers from the scene of the assault at the moment the assault was alleged to have occurred, and no reasonable account of human movement could explain the discrepancy. Justice Fenwick took a recess to review the full exhibit. She came back 40 minutes later. She acquitted Owen Hartwell on all charges. Elliot was already in the corridor when the doors opened. He was thinking about the walk back to the subway, about whether there was coffee anywhere nearby, about the overnight shift that started at 11, and the particular silence of an empty lobby at 3 in the morning. "Mr. Chandra." He turned. Justice Renata Fenwick was standing in the corridor in her robes, which was unusual enough that the few people around them had gone quiet and were doing the thing where they very deliberately looked away while listening. "Your Honor," he said. She studied him for a moment. She had the direct, appraising look of someone who assessed people for a living and had gotten very good at it. The cell tower data, she said. You identified that independently. It wasn't quite a question. It was in the public record, Elliot said. A lot of things are in the public record. She paused. You were Crown, if I'm not mistaken. British Columbia. About a decade ago. Something moved in Elliot's chest. Yes, the Aldridge case. A pause. Yes, he said. Justice Fenwick looked at him for a long moment. Not with pity, he would have found pity difficult to stand. With something closer to recognition. What you did in there, she said. And Elliot understood she meant not the technical identification, but the choice, the return, the decision to stay in the corridor outside courtroom 7 for 4 days instead of walking away. It mattered. He didn't know what to say to that. He'd spent 14 months not knowing what to say to most things. The Law Society of Ontario, Justice Fenwick said, and reached into the fold of her robe and produced a business card, which she held out to him. There are people who would be interested in speaking with you if you were open to it. A legal matter of this nature, the work you did, it speaks for itself. Elliot looked at the card. He didn't take it immediately. I'm not sure I'm the right person, he said, for that kind of work, Mr. Chandra. Her voice was very quiet. You saved that boy because you couldn't stop seeing the gap in the data that everyone else walked past. That is exactly the right person. A beat. Think about it. She handed him the card, nodded once, and walked back toward the courtroom. Elliot stood in the corridor with the business card in his hand. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere behind him, a door opened and he heard Sylvie Hartwell's voice, and then, threading through it, a younger voice. Uncertain, a little hoarse, the voice of someone who had spent 3 weeks in a very small, very frightening space and was only just beginning to understand they were out of it. He didn't turn around. He wasn't sure he was ready for that yet. But he looked at the card for a long time. And then he put it in the pocket of his gray sweater, next to the pull near the left cuff, and he stood a little straighter than he had in 14 months. I want to be honest with you. When I first heard about Elliot Chandra, when this story came across my desk, if you want to call it that, my first thought was that nobody was going to believe it. A former Crown prosecutor mopping floors, a 17-year-old's freedom hinging on 11 minutes, and a data file that 24 legal professionals had walked past. A judge handing a business card to a man in an old sweater in a courthouse corridor. But here's the thing I've learned. The longer I tell these stories, the moments that change people's lives almost never look the way you'd expect. They don't arrive announced. They don't come with the right lighting or the right credentials or the right shoes. They come as a gap in a data set at 2 in the morning. They come as a knock on a door at 2:47 a.m. They come as the decision to sit in the same chair in a public gallery for 4 days, because you can't stop seeing something that everyone else has stopped looking for. Elliot Chandra didn't save Owen Hartwell because he was trying to rebuild his career. He saved him because he couldn't stand the alternative. That matters. I think that matters a lot. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever felt passed over or looked through or judged before anyone bothered to look, leave a comment below and tell me. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me about someone you know who was the most capable person in the room and was the last one anyone thought to listen to. I want to read every single one of those comments because those stories are why this channel exists. Like this video if you believe that what you know is worth more than what you look like. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to Dell Stories, because next week I have another one for you, and I promise it will stay with you. The world is full of Elliot Chandras. Most of them never get a corridor moment, never get a card pressed into their hand by someone who finally looked close enough to see them. But some of them do. And on the days when they do, the right person was paying attention.